My brother borrowed $20,000 from me, then my parents told me to forget about it. The text came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, which should have been my first warning sign because my brother Derek never texted that late unless something had already gone wrong before he worked up the nerve to ask for help. Hey, can we talk tomorrow? Kind of a big favor. I should mention before I get into what happened that Derek and I had always had what I'd call an easy relationship. 3 years apart, close enough growing up to share friends in high school, distant enough as adults that we mostly connected over holidays and the occasional weekend visit. He worked in commercial real estate, or at least he had for the past 6 years, doing well enough that I never had reason to worry about him financially. I worked as a civil engineer, married to my wife Rachel, with a mortgage and 2 kids, and the kind of steady, unglamorous financial discipline that meant we had savings, a real emergency fund, the product of a decade of careful budgeting that neither of us took lightly. Growing up, Derek was always the more outgoing one, the one who made friends easily, who talked his way into things, better seats at concerts, discounts from strangers, opportunities that seemed to fall into his lap through sheer charisma rather than effort. I was the planner, the one who read the fine print, who kept a spreadsheet of my allowance as a kid long before anyone taught me to. Our parents used to joke about it at dinner, calling Derek the closer and me the accountant, a distinction that felt harmless and even a little affectionate back then before I understood how it would eventually calcify into an assumption that Derek's charm would always be enough to carry him, while my caution was simply background noise, expected and unremarkable, the water I swam in rather than something anyone thought to appreciate directly. That dynamic followed us into adulthood almost exactly as you'd predict. Derek chased big swings, flashy deals, aggressive investments, the kind of high-risk, high-reward moves that occasionally paid off spectacularly and I would later learn far more often didn't. I built slowly, methodically, taking a steady engineering job right out of school, marrying Rachel 5 years later, buying a modest house well within our means rather than stretching for something flashier. For most of our adult lives, this difference in approach didn't create friction. Derek had his path, I had mine, and we mostly respected the distance between them. Derek called me the next morning before I'd even had coffee. He explained in the halting, embarrassed way people explain things they've clearly rehearsed but still can't quite say cleanly, that a deal he'd been counting on had fallen through at the last minute, that he had a bridge loan payment due in 9 days that he couldn't cover, and that if he missed it, he'd lose a property he'd already sunk significant money into securing. He needed $20,000. He said it like he was asking to borrow a ladder. I'll pay you back within 3 months, he said. Maybe less, this is temporary, I swear, I just need to get through this one gap. I want to be honest that I hesitated, not because I doubted my brother's sincerity in that moment, but because $20,000 was not a small favor for us, not something Rachel and I could hand over without feeling it. I told him I needed to talk to Rachel first, which he understood, though I could hear the disappointment in his voice, like he'd expected an immediate yes simply because we were brothers. Rachel and I talked about it that night at our kitchen table, running numbers, weighing what it would mean to pull that much from our savings. In the end, we decided to do it, but not blindly. I drafted a simple promissory note, nothing elaborate, just a document stating the amount, the repayment timeline, and both our signatures, because Rachel wisely insisted that even family loans needed to be treated like actual loans if we wanted any real chance of getting the money back. Eric signed it without complaint, even joked that I was being very civil engineer about the whole thing, precise and structured, and I remember feeling reassured by how easily he agreed to formalize it. In hindsight, I think that ease should have told me something different than what I took from it at the time. The money went out. Derek made his bridge loan payment. The property deal, as far as I understood at the time, closed successfully. For the first month, everything seemed fine. He texted an update, thanked me again, said things were on track. The second month, the update didn't come. I texted to check in casually, not wanting to seem like I was hovering. He responded a day later with something vague about a delay in a separate deal, said the repayment might slip to month 4 instead of 3, but that it was still coming, still solid. I told him that was fine, mostly because I believed him, and also because pressing harder felt, at the time, like the kind of thing that would strain a relationship over a delay that still seemed reasonable. By month 5, with still no repayment and increasingly vague responses to my check-ins, I started to feel something shift from mild concern into real unease. I brought it up during a family dinner at my parents' house, mentioning it casually to my mother while we were alone in the kitchen, expecting sympathy, or at least acknowledgement that this was a strange amount of time for a 3-month, maybe less loan to still be unpaid. The months between 2 and 5 had their own slow accumulation of small warning signs I mostly talked myself out of taking seriously at the time. Eric stopped mentioning specific numbers in his updates, shifting from "I should have it to you by the 15th" to vaguer phrases like "still working through some things" or "closer than you'd think." He started avoiding phone calls in favor of texts, which meant I could never quite pin down a tone, never quite tell if he sounded stressed or evasive or simply busy. Rachel noticed the pattern before I let myself fully acknowledge it. "He's managing you," she said one night, after I read her his latest text update out loud. "Notice how every single message sounds reassuring but never actually commits to anything concrete." I remember bristling slightly at that, some old instinct to defend my brother kicking in automatically, before I sat with it long enough to realize she was probably right. I brought it up during a family dinner at my parents' house, mentioning it casually to my mother while we were alone in the kitchen, expecting sympathy or at least acknowledgement that this was a strange amount of time for a 3-month, maybe less loan to still be unpaid. What I got instead was the first sign of what would become months of increasingly frustrating conversations. Derek's going through a rough patch, my mother said. The real estate market's been difficult. I really think you should give him some grace here. I have been giving him grace, I said. It's been 5 months. He hasn't given me a real update in weeks. He's your brother, she said, in the tone she always used when she wanted a conversation to be over before it had really started. I'm sure he's doing everything he can. I let it go that night, mostly because arguing with my mother in her own kitchen during a holiday dinner felt like the wrong venue for a fight I suspected was coming eventually anyway. I didn't yet understand how deep the disconnect between my expectations and my family's expectations actually ran. The real turning point came at month 7 when I finally sat Derek down in person at a coffee shop halfway between our 2 houses and asked him directly for a real answer, not a vague update, an actual plan with dates and numbers. What came out over the following hour was far worse than a delayed repayment. The property deal that the loan had originally been meant to secure had fallen apart entirely months earlier in a way he hadn't told me about. He'd used a portion of what remained from my $20,000, plus additional funds from a separate, smaller loan he'd taken from a coworker, to cover a different, unrelated financial hole. A hole, it turned out, related to a pattern of over-leveraged investments he'd been making for over a year, chasing deals that hadn't panned out, digging himself progressively deeper while telling everyone around him, including me, that things were fine. I didn't want to worry you, he said, which had apparently become his explanation for nearly everything. I thought I could turn it around before it became a real problem. He went on haltingly, filling in details I hadn't asked for but needed to hear anyway. There had been 3 separate deals over the past 18 months, each one meant to be the thing that finally put him ahead, each one requiring him to leverage more than he probably should have, using proceeds from one deal to cover shortfalls in another, a pattern that he described almost clinically, like he was talking about someone else's finances rather than his own. The coworker loan I hadn't known about was actually the second of 2. There had been an earlier, smaller loan from a coworker that he'd already repaid, which had apparently given him enough confidence in his ability to juggle debts that he'd taken on progressively larger ones without fully reckoning with how thin the margins actually were. How much do you actually owe total right now? I asked, bracing myself for the answer. He hesitated long enough that I already knew it was going to be worse than I expected. Around $35,000 across a few different things. Yours is the biggest single piece of it, $35,000. I sat with that number for a long moment, watching him avoid my eyes, understanding for the first time that this wasn't a single unfortunate deal gone wrong. This was a pattern sustained over more than a year, hidden carefully enough that neither I nor, as far as I could tell, our parents had any real sense of how deep it actually ran. I thought about all the family dinners over that same stretch where Derek had seemed perfectly normal, cracking jokes, asking about my kids, giving no visible indication that he was quietly juggling debts across multiple lenders, while telling at least one of us a story that didn't match reality. I'm working on it, he said. I've got some things in motion, I just need more time. I left that coffee shop angrier than I think I'd ever been at my brother in our entire adult relationship, not just because of the money, though the money mattered enormously, but because of the months of vague reassurances that I now understood had been at best wishful thinking and at worst deliberate stalling while he figured out how to manage a financial situation that had nothing to do with the original story he'd told me. I did what felt like the reasonable next step. I brought it to my parents directly, not casually in a kitchen this time, but deliberately, sitting them both down and laying out exactly what Derek had told me, the promissory note, the timeline, the full picture as I now understood it. I expected concern. I expected at minimum some acknowledgement that this had gone well beyond a temporary favor into something closer to a serious breach of trust. What I got instead reshaped how I understood my entire family. You have a signed agreement, my father said, unbothered, almost dismissive. I'm sure he'll pay you back eventually. In the meantime, I really think you should let this go for now. Pressuring him is only going to make things harder on him and on the family. Let it go, I repeated. Dad, this is $20,000. That's not a rounding error for us. That's years of savings. Understand it's a lot of money, my mother said, but think about what pursuing this aggressively could do to your relationship with your brother. Is $20,000 really worth losing him over? I'm not trying to lose him over it, I said. I'm trying to get repaid for a loan he agreed to in writing. Those aren't the same thing. To him right now they might feel like the same thing, my father said. He's under a lot of stress. Piling more stress on top of that isn't going to help anyone. Family helps family. You've always been the more financially stable one. Maybe this is just part of that. That phrase, you've always been the more financially stable one, landed with a specific kind of weight, because I understood hearing it that my own discipline, my own years of careful saving and budgeting were somehow being used against me, reframed not as something I'd earned through years of deliberate choices, but as a resource the family felt entitled to lean on indefinitely, without consequence, simply because I'd been responsible enough to have something to lean on in the first place. So the plan, I said slowly, is that I just absorb $20,000, permanently, because I happen to be the one who can afford to. Nobody's saying permanently, my father said, though his tone suggested he hadn't actually thought that far ahead, hadn't considered what letting it go for now actually meant in practice beyond making an uncomfortable conversation end sooner. Then what are you saying exactly? Give me a real timeline. And does letting it go for now turn into me actually getting repaid? Neither of them had an answer for that, and the silence that followed told me more than anything either of them had said up to that point. They hadn't been thinking about this as a temporary pause with a defined end point. They'd been thinking about it as a problem that would simply stop being uncomfortable if I stopped bringing it up, the same strategy I realized that Derek himself seemed to have been using for the past 7 months. My mother tried a different angle. You know how your father and I feel about this family staying close. Money has torn apart so many families we know. We just don't want that to happen to us. I don't want that either, I said. But pretending $20,000 isn't real or that I'm somehow the villain for wanting to be repaid on terms Derek agreed to himself isn't protecting this family. It's just protecting Derek from consequences at my expense and calling it family unity. She changed the subject to something about Thanksgiving plans, the way she always did when a conversation reached a point she didn't want to sit in any longer, and I left that dinner with a knot in my stomach that didn't loosen for weeks. Rachel, when I told her everything that had happened, was less diplomatic than I'd been at that table. They're asking you to just eat $20,000 because Derek can't manage his own finances, and framing it like you're the unreasonable one for wanting the money you're legally owed back. That's not family helping family. That's family exploiting the one member responsible enough to have savings. She wasn't wrong, and hearing her say it plainly helped me see the situation with a clarity I'd been missing, clouded as I was by years of instinct telling me not to make waves, not to be the difficult one, not to prioritize money over harmony in a family that had always prized surface-level peace over honest conflict. Rachel and I spent an entire evening after that conversation just talking through what our options actually were, laying them out almost like a project plan, the way I'd approach any other problem at work. We could write off the money entirely and treat it as a painful but final lesson about lending to family. We could escalate through more aggressive means, potentially involving a lawyer, which felt disproportionate for a first step and risked permanently detonating the relationship. Or we could treat the promissory note exactly as what it was, a legitimate financial agreement, and enforce it calmly, formally, without theatrics, giving Derek a real structure to work within rather than the open-ended vagueness that had let 8 months slip by without any actual progress. Rachel was the one who pushed me toward that third option specifically, pointing out that everything Derek had done so far suggested he responded to vague, unstructured requests with vague, unstructured excuses, and that maybe what this situation actually needed wasn't more patience but more structure. I decided after that conversation with Rachel that I wasn't going to simply let it go the way my parents wanted me to. I also decided I wasn't going to escalate things dramatically either, no lawsuits, no dramatic family blow-ups at holiday dinners. Instead, I went back to the promissory note itself, the document Derek had signed without complaint 8 months earlier, and I treated it exactly the way I would treat any other formal loan that had gone into default. I sent Derek a written notice, calm and factual, referencing the specific terms of our agreement, laying out a revised repayment plan with concrete monthly amounts and dates, and stating clearly that if the revised plan wasn't honored, I would need to explore other options to recover what I was owed. Derek called me almost immediately after receiving it, more rattled than I'd heard him in months. "You're treating me like some random debtor," he said. "This feels really harsh considering I'm your brother. You signed a document agreeing to specific terms," I said. "You're the one who broke those terms repeatedly for 8 months while giving me vague updates that turned out not to reflect what was actually happening with the money. I'm not trying to punish you. I'm trying to get repaid for a loan you asked me for under terms you agreed to yourself." My parents, once they found out about the written notice, Derek had apparently gone straight to them, upset, framing it as me threatening him, were furious with me in a way that stunned me more than anything else in this entire saga. My mother called, her voice tight with an anger I rarely heard directed at me specifically. "How could you do that to your own brother, sending him some kind of formal legal letter like he's a stranger? He's treated like a stranger would be treated in this exact situation, Mom. If a stranger borrowed $20,000 from me and stopped paying it back for 8 months while telling me half-truths about why, I'd send exactly the same kind of letter. The only difference here is that everyone expects me to accept worse treatment specifically because Derek happens to be my brother." "You're being cold," she said. "This isn't who you are." "This is exactly who I am," I said, and I meant it more firmly than I expected to in the moment. "I'm someone who honors agreements and expects the people I love to do the same. What's actually different here is that for the first time I'm not letting 'he's your brother' be used as a reason to excuse behavior that would be unacceptable from literally anyone else." My father got on the phone shortly after, taking a slightly different approach, one that felt more calculated, more like an attempt to negotiate than an expression of genuine anger. "Let's think about this practically," he said. "If you push too hard and Derek can't pay because he's stretched thin across multiple debts, what actually happens? You've damaged the relationship for nothing because he still won't have the money." "The risk I'm willing to take," I said, "because the alternative, based on the last 8 months of evidence, is that nothing changes at all unless there are actual consequences attached to it. So this is about punishing him. This is about being repaid for a loan he asked me for that he signed an agreement for that he's now 8 months late on. I don't know how many different ways I can say that before it stops sounding like punishment to you and starts sounding like a reasonable expectation." That conversation didn't end warmly. My mother hung up more upset than I'd heard her in years, and for the following month family gatherings felt strained in a way they never had before, my parents polite but clipped, Derek avoiding direct conversation with me entirely, communicating instead through careful, formal texts about the revised repayment schedule. But something in that written notice worked in a way that 8 months of soft, informal check-ins never had. Derek made his first payment under the revised plan on time, then his second, My parents slowly over the following months stopped bringing up how harsh I'd been and started, cautiously, acknowledging that maybe some structure had actually been what the situation needed all along. It took just over 2 years for Derek to fully repay the $20,000 in monthly installments that were sometimes late by a few days but never missed entirely. Not once after that formal notice reset the terms of how we were operating with each other. We're not as easy with each other as we used to be. There's a formality now, a careful politeness in how we discuss money that wasn't there before any of this happened. I've made peace with that. I think some relationships settle into a slightly cooler, more structured version of themselves after something like this, and that's not necessarily a tragedy. It's just what honesty costs sometimes, when the alternative was letting resentment quietly rot something that mattered to me even more than the money did. Derek and I had one more real conversation about it, almost a year into the repayment plan, over beers at a bar neither of us usually went to, neutral territory away from any family dinner table. He apologized in a way that felt more genuine than anything he'd said during the actual crisis, admitting that he'd known somewhere around month 3 that he wasn't going to hit the original timeline and had simply kept delaying the honest conversation because he was ashamed, and because some part of him assumed I'd eventually just let it go the way our parents seemed to expect. "I think I was banking on you being the reasonable one," he said, "the way you always are. I didn't think you'd actually hold the line." I told him that was exactly the problem, that being reliably reasonable had apparently become, in this family, a kind of standing invitation to be taken advantage of, and that I didn't plan on letting that particular pattern define the rest of our relationship going forward. My parents and I are close again too, though I noticed in the years since that they've never quite acknowledged directly how badly they mishandled that entire situation, how their instinct to protect Derek's comfort came, without them seeming to realize it, at the direct expense of my own financial stability and my own legitimate right to be repaid. I've decided not to keep pushing for that acknowledgement. Some things I've learned you simply carry forward as knowledge about the people you love, without needing them to fully agree with your version of events in order to move ahead with the relationship anyway. What I know for certain is that the next time anyone in my family asks me to simply forget about money that's rightfully mine, I'll remember exactly how that request felt the first time, and I won't be quite so quick to agree just to keep the peace.